There are secrets that cling to the shadows, desperate to be told. We drag them into the light. Welcome to Gravevale Echoes. There are visions that come in dreams, and then there are those that force their way into our waking world. For one collector, a prized antique doll's house becomes a horrifying window into a repeating supernatural tragedy. Mr. Arthur Dillett was a man who lived by the clockwork of his own quiet routines. His days were for scholarship and acquisition, for hunting down the rare and the beautiful in dusty antique shops and cluttered auction houses. But his nights were for contemplation. After the house had fallen silent, after the servants had retired to their quarters and the last embers in the dining room hearth had turned to gray ash, he would retreat to his study. This room was the heart of his world, a sanctuary lined with the silent, leather-bound companionship of 1,000 books, a room that smelled of old paper, of beeswax, and of the faint, pleasant aroma of his nightly glass of port. It was here, in this fortress of logic and learning, that he would commune with his treasures. He would sit in his deep leather armchair, the fire crackling a soft, gentle rhythm, and he would examine his latest prize. He would feel the heft of an ancient coin, trace the intricate carvings on a silver snuff box, or simply admire the form and artistry of a unique piece. It was a peaceful, orderly, and deeply satisfying ritual. Tonight, however, the object of his contemplation was different. It was his newest, and perhaps his proudest, acquisition. Against the far wall of the study, occupying a place of supreme honor on a sturdy mahogany table, sat the doll's house. It was a magnificent thing, a masterpiece of a bygone era, an architecturally perfect, 3-story replica of an Elizabethan manor, complete with timbered gables, leaded glass windows, and a heavy oak door. It was less a toy and more a miniature world, a perfect, frozen moment in time. Mr. Dillett had been thrilled with his purchase, acquiring it from a nervous, evasive dealer who had seemed almost desperate to be rid of it. This, to Mr. Dillett, had only added to its provenance, a hint of a mysterious past that made the object all the more alluring. He had spent the better part of the evening admiring it, opening its hinged front to marvel at the exquisitely detailed rooms within, the tiny furniture, the miniature portraits, the 4 unervingly realistic wax dolls that served as its inhabitants. It was all perfect. Now, its front was closed, and it sat in the shadows, a silent, dark monolith at the edge of the firelight. Mr. Dillett had become lost in a particularly dense passage of a book on Roman antiquities, the rest of the world fading away as he focused on the text. The only sound was the soft crackle of the fire and the steady, reassuring tick-tock of the tall grandfather clock in the hall, a sound that was the very heartbeat of his well-ordered home. He was a man at peace, secure in his own quiet, scholarly kingdom. It was the clock that broke the spell. He was startled from his deep concentration by the clock beginning to chime the hour. It was a deep, resonant, and familiar sound. He counted the tolls automatically, a subconscious habit. 10, 11, 12, midnight, but it did not stop. The 13th chime was a deep, sonorous boom that seemed to hang in the air for a moment longer than the others. 1 o'clock in the morning. He sighed, realizing how late it had become. He marked his page, drained the last of the deep red port from his glass, and rose from his chair, stretching his stiff limbs. It was time for bed. As he turned to extinguish the oil lamp on his reading table, his gaze swept across the room and fell, as it always did, upon his new prized possession. And in that moment, the peaceful, orderly world of Mr. Arthur Dillett came to an end. The doll's house was no longer dark. A faint, pale, and utterly inexplicable light was shining from within it. He froze, his hand hovering over the lamp. He stared across the shadowed expanse of his study at the antique toy. It was not a reflection. His lamp was behind him, and the fire in the hearth was now just a soft, glowing bed of embers. There was no other source of light in the room, and yet the doll's house glowed. It was a soft, sickly internal luminescence, a ghostly light that seemed to be radiating from the very walls of the miniature structure. He could see it clearly through the tiny, diamond-paned windows of the drawing room and the nursery, a weak, flickering, pale white light, like the glow of 100 tiny, spectral candles. His first reaction was one of pure academic disbelief. His mind, trained in logic and evidence, scrambled for a rational explanation. A trick of the moonlight? He strode to the heavy velvet curtains of his study and pulled them aside. The sky outside was a blanket of thick, starless cloud. There was no moon. Phosphorescent paint, perhaps used by a whimsical creator? Unlikely, given the age and quality of the piece. And besides, the light was not the steady, fading glow of phosphorescence. It was flickering. It was alive. A cold, creeping unease began to work its way up his spine. He remembered the strange, nervous energy of the dealer who had sold it to him, the man's haste to finalize the deal, his refusal to look directly at the object. He remembered the odd stories the man had hinted at, tales of the house's previous owner, a reclusive old man who had become obsessed with it, who claimed it came alive at night. Mr. Dillett had dismissed them as the fanciful sales tactics of a desperate man. Now he was not so sure. He let the curtain fall and turned back to face the room. The doll's house continued its silent, ghostly shining. The house was a stage. He had the sudden, terrifying, and irresistible conviction that a play was about to begin, a play that had been performed in this miniature theater many times before, for an audience of one. The chiming of the clock had not just marked the hour. It had been an overture. It had been the signal for the curtain to rise. His fear, which was considerable, was slowly being overpowered by a different, more powerful emotion. The insatiable curiosity of the collector. He had to know. He had to see. He had to understand the secret of his new possession. He was the owner of this world, the god of this tiny, impossible universe. He had a right to witness its mysteries. He began to walk towards it, his footsteps silent on the thick rug. Each step was a conscious decision, a step away from the world of reason and into a realm of supernatural possibility that he had, until this moment, only ever read about in books. As he drew closer, the faint light seemed to pulse, a slow, sickly, rhythmic beat, as if the house itself had a faint, ghostly heart. He reached the table and stood over the glowing artifact. It was a beautiful and now a deeply sinister object. He had a choice. He could open the hinged front and expose the entire interior at once, a direct and bold confrontation with the impossible. Or he could be a more cautious, more secretive observer. He could become a voyeur, peering into this private, spectral world through its own windows. He chose the latter. The idea of flinging the front open felt like a violation, an act of aggression that might have unknown and terrifying consequences. He would be a silent witness. He crouched down, his body trembling slightly, and positioned his eye before the main window of the ground-floor drawing room. He held his breath and peered inside. The midnight stage was set. The tragedy was about to begin. Mr. Dillett pressed his eye to the tiny, diamond-paned window, a cold bead of glass against his warm skin. The world of his familiar, firelit study vanished, and he was plunged, as if through a portal, into the strange, spectral reality of the room within. It was no longer a miniature. It was a life-sized world, and he was a giant, invisible god peering in at the private agonies of its inhabitants. The faint, ghostly light he had seen from across the room was now revealed to be a cold, sterile, and all-pervading luminescence. It was a light without a source, seeming to emanate from the very walls, the floor, the tiny, ornate furniture. It bathed the scene in a pale, clinical glow that bleached the color from everything, rendering the drawing room in shades of white, gray, and deep, abyssal black. And the scene was no longer static. The dreadful, silent play had begun. The 4 dolls he had so carefully examined that afternoon were no longer lifeless effigies of wax and fabric. A horrifying, unnatural semblance of life had been breathed into them. They were moving, but it was not the fluid, graceful motion of living beings. It was a stiff, jerky, and deeply disturbing animation, like puppets being manipulated by a clumsy, malevolent puppeteer. Each movement was a series of tiny, almost imperceptible starts and stops, a horrifying parody of life that was far more unsettling than any ghostly apparition could have been. His attention was first drawn to the old woman doll. She was no longer sitting placidly in her high-backed chair. She was standing near the miniature, unlit fireplace, her back to the window through which he was peering. Her tiny body was rigid with tension, her head bowed, and her stiff, waxen hands were pressed to the sides of her face in a timeless, universal gesture of terror or profound grief. Even from behind, her posture screamed of a silent, internal agony. Then he saw the old man. He had also vacated his chair and was now in the center of the room, near a small, intricately carved table. He was pacing. Back and forth he went, a frantic 3-inch journey from the table to the base of the staircase, then back again. His movements were agitated. His tiny, formally dressed body stiff with a terrible anxiety. His head, with its placid, unchanging painted smile, was turned sharply, his gaze fixed on the dark, shadowed archway of the staircase that led to the upper floors. The juxtaposition of his frantic, terrified pacing and his serene, smiling face was a grotesque and nauseating sight. He was a man trapped in a nightmare, his own face a cruel, ironic mask he could not remove. Mr. Dillett felt a cold sweat begin to form on his forehead. He was a witness to a silent, domestic drama of the highest intensity. The occupants of the house were in a state of extreme fear. They were anticipating something. They were listening, waiting for a threat that they knew was coming. And as the old man doll stared at the staircase, Mr. Dillett knew that the threat was not outside the house. It was already inside. Following the doll's terrified gaze, Mr. Dillett shifted his own attention to the miniature staircase. The upper landing was a pool of deep, impenetrable shadow, a place the ghostly light did not seem to touch. For a long moment he saw nothing but the darkness. Then, out of that darkness, something began to move. It was not one of the other dolls. It was something new, something that did not belong. It was a figure, a stooping, hunched shape that seemed to be made of solidified gloom. Its form was indistinct, its edges wavering and uncertain, but its posture was unmistakable. It was a posture of a predator, of a creature that was used to creeping and crawling in dark, forgotten places. It was a thing of pure, condensed malevolence. As he watched, paralyzed with a horrified fascination, the shadowy figure began to descend the stairs. It did not walk down the steps with a normal gait. It crept, it slithered, its hunched form seeming to flow down the staircase like a trickle of black, viscous oil. The movement was slow, deliberate, and filled with a terrible, patient menace. The air in Mr. Dillett's own study, which had been comfortably warm, now seemed to be filled with a profound and unnatural chill. The miniature horror he was witnessing was leaking its grave-like cold out into his world. Downstairs, in the drawing room, the old man doll abruptly stopped his frantic pacing. He stood frozen in the center of the room, a tiny, solitary figure facing the entrance to the staircase. He seemed to be gathering himself, his jerky, unnatural life force coalescing for a final, futile act of defiance. He raised his arm, his tiny hand pointing an accusing finger at the darkness from which the intruder was emerging. The shadow figure reached the bottom of the stairs. It paused there for a moment, a hunched silhouette in the doorway, its features completely lost in its own personal darkness. It seemed to be savoring the moment, a predator enjoying the terror of its cornered prey. Then it lunged. It moved with a sudden, shocking speed that was a blur to Mr. Dillett's eye. It shot across the tiny room, a projectile of pure, concentrated malice. The two figures, the small, defiant old man and the larger, hunched shadow collided in the center of the drawing room. And the silent, terrible murder began. Mr. Dillett was incapable of looking away. He was a helpless god, watching a tragedy unfold in a world he had created by the simple act of purchasing an object. He saw the old man doll, his tiny body flailing in a silent, desperate struggle for his life. He saw the shadow figure's arms, if they could be called arms, wrap around the doll in a dark, crushing embrace. There was no sound, no tiny, waxen scream, no crash of miniature furniture. There was only the horrifying, silent pantomime of a vicious, brutal struggle, a ballet of death playing out in a ghostly, illuminated box. The fight was horribly, mercifully brief. The last of the old man doll's defiant energy seemed to evaporate. His limbs, which had been moving with such frantic, jerky life, went limp. The unnatural spark that had animated him was extinguished. The shadow figure held the now lifeless doll for a moment longer, as if to make certain its work was done, and then it simply let him drop. The old man doll fell to the floor in a pathetic, disordered heap. His head was bent back at an impossible angle. His limbs splayed out unnaturally. The painted smile on his face now seemed like the ultimate grotesque mockery. He was once again just an object, a piece of a tragic tableau. His part in the dreadful play concluded. A profound, deathly stillness descended upon the miniature room. The shadow figure stood over its victim for a long, silent moment, a dark, stooping victor on a miniature battlefield. The old woman doll remained by the fireplace, her hand still pressed to her face, a silent, eternal witness to her husband's murder. Then, as silently and as mysteriously as it had appeared, the shadow began to retreat. It did not walk away. It seemed to dissolve, its form unraveling, its dark essence melting back into the ambient gloom of the house. It receded into the shadows from which it had been born, until, finally, it was gone. The first act of the terrible, silent tragedy was over. Mr. Dillett was left staring at the aftermath. A murdered man on the floor and a grieving widow by the hearth. The ghostly light in the house began to flicker and wane, as if the supernatural energy required for the performance had been spent. He understood now. This was not a one-time event. This was a curse, a moment of profound, violent tragedy, trapped in this house like a recording, doomed to replay itself, night after night, for any unfortunate soul who happened to be watching when the clock struck one. The thrill of the collector had been replaced by the cold, sickening dread of a man who realizes he has not purchased a mere antique. He has purchased a perpetual nightmare. And the most terrifying part was the dawning realization that the play might not be over. This was only the first act, and he had no idea what other horrors were waiting, silently, in the wings. The spectral light within the doll's house continued to fade, the terrible energy of the murder scene now dissipating like heat from a cooling corpse. Mr. Dillett remained crouched in the darkness of his own study, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. He felt a profound sense of nausea, a deep, visceral revulsion at the silent, brutal pantomime he had just been forced to witness. The image of the shadow figure lunging, of the old man doll's final, pathetic struggle, was burned into his memory. He wanted to look away, to stand up and throw a heavy cloth over the entire, cursed object, to seal it away from his sight forever. But he couldn't. He was held captive by the sheer, morbid gravity of the scene, a helpless observer compelled to see the tragedy through to its bitter end. His attention, now that the violent actor had vanished from the stage, shifted to the survivors, the silent, grieving audience of this miniature hell. His gaze was drawn first to the figure of the old woman doll. She had not moved from her position by the tiny, cold hearth. But her posture, which had been one of active, hand-to-her-face terror during the attack, had now collapsed into something far more heartbreaking. She had slumped forward in her high-backed chair, her tiny waxen body conveying a sense of utter, soul-crushing defeat. Her head was bowed, her shoulders stooped. It was a perfect, miniature sculpture of a grief so profound, so absolute, that it had extinguished all other emotion. She was no longer afraid. She was simply broken, the eternal, silent witness to her husband's murder, doomed to sit in her endless, silent sorrow until the clock struck 1 again tomorrow night, when she would be forced to watch it all over again. A wave of pity, so absurd and yet so powerful, washed over Mr. Dillett. She was just a doll, a thing of wax and fabric, yet her grief felt more real and more poignant than any human sorrow he had ever witnessed. Slowly, reluctantly, he tore his gaze away from the grieving widow and let it travel upwards, to the second floor of the house, to the nursery. The faint, ghostly light was weaker here, the shadows deeper, but he could still make out the scene. The nursemaid doll was standing exactly where she had been before the tragedy began. She stood rigidly beside the empty cradle, a tall, severe figure in a plain gray dress. Her painted face, with its simple, emotionless features, was turned towards the door of the nursery, as if she were looking down the staircase towards the drawing room below. A new, chilling thought pricked at Mr. Dillett's mind. The nursemaid had been there on the upper floor throughout the entire event. She must have seen the stooping shadow as it crept past the nursery door. She must have heard the silent, spectral struggle from the room below. And yet she had not moved. Her posture had not changed. She remained a stiff, indifferent observer, a silent accomplice to the horror. Her stillness was not the stillness of an inanimate object. It was the still, watchful calm of someone who was uninvolved, unconcerned. Or perhaps, someone who knew the intruder, and knew that its terrible work was a necessary, recurring part of the life of this house. Her emotionless, painted face suddenly seemed not placid, but cold, cruel, and complicit. She was not just a nursemaid. She was a guard, a warden in this prison of repeating sorrow. His eyes, full of a new sense of unease, drifted from the sinister figure of the nursemaid to the cradle beside her. It was a small, intricately carved wooden cradle, lined with tiny, delicate blankets. It was where the fourth doll, the baby, was supposed to be. He had only seen the top of its round, bald head when he had first examined the house. And then he noticed it, a flicker of movement from within the cradle. His blood, which had begun to return to a normal temperature, turned instantly to ice. Not again. Not another one. The thought of the baby doll also coming to life, perhaps to wail a silent, ghostly cry for its murdered grandfather, was a horror he did not think he could bear. But the movement was wrong. The blankets were stirring, yes, but not with the small, feeble motions of a tiny infant. The blankets were being pushed upwards, stretched from within, by a form that was clearly much larger than the baby doll. The movement was a slow, convulsive, and deeply unnatural undulation, like a snake moving beneath a sheet. Something else was in the cradle. The baby doll was gone. It had been replaced by something else. Or perhaps there had never been a baby doll at all. Perhaps the round, bald head he had seen was just the top of this other, more horrifying occupant. As he watched, his breath caught in his throat. The form beneath the blankets began to rise. It pushed the delicate, lace-trimmed coverings aside with a slow, deliberate strength. A pale, misshapen head emerged into the faint, ghostly light of the nursery. It was a sight so grotesque, so fundamentally wrong, that Mr. Dillett's mind recoiled, refusing at first to process what it was seeing. This was not a doll. This was a thing. He stared, his mind struggling to categorize the abomination that was now slowly, deliberately, pulling itself up into a sitting position in the tiny cradle. It was a creature, an entity that had no place in the natural world, and certainly no place in a child's nursery. This was the true secret of the doll's house. The murder, the stooping shadow, the grieving widow, they were all just a prologue, a theatrical curtain raiser for the main event. They were a distraction from the real horror, which had been hiding in plain sight all along, disguised as an innocent infant, waiting patiently in the cradle for its moment to emerge. Mr. Dillett now understood with a chilling, soul-deep certainty. The stooping, shadowy figure that had committed the murder was not the house's greatest threat. It was its protector. It was a spectral guard dog, a dark sentry whose purpose was to carry out the grim, repeating ritual that somehow contained or placated this other, more terrible entity. The murder was a sacrifice, a nightly offering to the unspeakable thing that lived in the nursery. A new jolt of terror, sharper and more intelligent than his initial shock, shot through him. He realized that the stooping shadow had not been the only intruder in the house that night. There had always been two unholy things that did not belong. One was a violent, active agent of malice, and the other was a quiet, hidden, and infinitely more monstrous presence. The true king of this miniature, cursed castle was the thing in the cradle, and its reign was about to begin. The creature in the cradle rose with an agonizing slowness, a nightmare unfurling in the pale, ghostly light of the nursery. Mr. Dillett's mind, which had already been battered by the impossible, now teetered on the brink of complete collapse. This was a horror of a different order, a thing so fundamentally wrong, so utterly alien, that it seemed to mock the very concept of reality. The form that emerged from the tiny blankets was a grotesque parody of a human infant. Its skin was a sickly, doughy white, the color of bleached bone or a fungus that grows in the deepest sunless dark. It was slick and damp-looking, its surface pitted and porous, like the skin of an amphibian. Its body was soft, ill-defined, and boneless-looking, a formless lump of pale, living putty that was far too large for the delicate cradle it inhabited. It was a cancer, a tumorous growth that had gestated in the heart of the house's sorrow. But it was the head that was the epicenter of the horror. It was a large, misshapen sphere, and it turned with a slow, deliberate motion towards the nursery window, towards the spot where Mr. Dillett was peering in. And he saw its face. Two eyes, set wide apart, bulged from the pale, doughy flesh. They were not human eyes. They were immense, perfectly round, and as black as polished jet. They were lidless, unblinking, and seemed to possess no pupil, no iris, no sign of any emotion save for a cold, ancient, and utterly alien awareness. They were the eyes of an insect or a deep-sea creature, things that live by a different set of rules, a different kind of life. And between these two terrible black orbs, a wide, thin, lipless slit stretched across the lower half of the face. It was not a mouth in any recognizable sense. It was a wound, a surgical incision in the pale flesh, and it was turned down at the corners in a permanent, silent expression of cosmic misery or perhaps profound, unending hunger. The creature was a monstrous, blasphemous hybrid of a human baby and a gigantic, albino frog. A low, guttural sound of pure revulsion was torn from Mr. Dillett's throat, a sound he was not even aware of making. He wanted to look away, to break the connection, to flee from the sight of this unspeakable abomination. But he was paralyzed, held fast by a horrified fascination that was stronger than his own will. He was forced to bear witness. The creature did not remain in the cradle. The horror was not static. It was mobile. With a slow, fluid, and utterly silent motion, it began to move. It flowed, rather than climbed, over the side of the wooden cradle, its soft, boneless-looking body pouring onto the nursery floor like a thick, pale sludge. It moved with a purpose, a dreadful, deliberate intention that was far more terrifying than any frantic, monstrous rage would have been. Once on the floor, it began to crawl. It did not crawl like a human child. It moved with a strange, undulating, reptilian motion, its pale, doughy body rippling as it pulled itself across the miniature floorboards. It was silent, utterly, completely silent. There was no sound of its flesh on the wood, no guttural cry, no hiss. There was only its slow, inexorable, and horrifyingly patient procession. It crawled out of the nursery and onto the upper landing, the same landing where the stooping, shadowy murderer had begun its descent just moments before. The creature paused there, its lumpy, pale form a beacon of grotesque horror in the deepening gloom. It seemed to be surveying its domain, the silent, tragic house that was its kingdom, its prison, and its hunting ground. And then, in a moment of pure, undiluted, and reality-shattering horror, the creature turned its head. The great, black, Bulging eyes swiveled in their sockets and looked directly out of the doll's house, through the tiny, grimy window of the upper landing, directly at Mr. Dillett. The connection was instantaneous and absolute. It was not a vague feeling of being watched. This was a direct, focused, and intelligent gaze. The creature saw him. It knew he was there, and in the depths of its black, unblinking eyes, he saw not madness or mindless hunger, but a cold, ancient, and calculating intelligence. It was the look of a scientist peering into a terrarium at a trapped insect. The roles had been reversed. He was not the observer, the collector, the god of this miniature world. He was the specimen, and the creature was the one who was watching. The moment their eyes locked, the final barrier between his world and the world of the doll's house seemed to dissolve. He felt a psychic jolt, a wave of nauseating vertigo, as if the creature's cold, alien consciousness were reaching out, touching his own. And at that exact terrible instant, a sound from the real world, from the quiet, respectable street outside his own study, ripped through the night. It was a scream. It was not a single, adult cry of alarm. It was a chorus of screams, high-pitched, piercing, and filled with a kind of raw, primal terror that only children can produce. It was the sound of young, innocent minds being confronted with an image so horrifying, so fundamentally wrong, that it had shattered their perception of reality. The screams were distant, coming from somewhere down the lane, but they were sharp, clear, and filled with an unmistakable note of shared, hysterical panic. A horrifying, impossible understanding crashed down on Mr. Dillett. The children outside, they were seeing what he was seeing. The doll's house was not a self-contained nightmare. It was a lens. It was a psychic amplifier, a supernatural broadcasting tower. And the abomination crawling across the upper landing was, at that very moment, projecting its own horrifying image out into the world, imprinting itself onto the minds of anyone, especially the sensitive and the innocent who happened to be nearby. The children were not screaming at a shadow or a mundane fright. They were screaming at the pale, frog-like creature with the bulging black eyes. They were his fellow audience members, unwillingly dragged into the same horrifying, supernatural theater. This final, terrible revelation was the blow that shattered his composure. The vision, its purpose fulfilled, its horror broadcast, broke apart. The ghostly, internal light of the doll's house, which had been fading, was now extinguished in an instant, as if a switch had been thrown in some other, unseen dimension. The pale, crawling creature, the grieving widow, the murdered husband, the complicit nurse, they all vanished, plunged back into the mundane, inanimate darkness of a simple antique toy. Mr. Dillett cried out, a strangled, terrified gasp, and scrambled backwards, falling away from the table. He landed in a heap on the floor, his mind a ruin, the distant, fading screams of the terrified children, and the image of the creature's cold, black eyes locked in a feedback loop of horror inside his head. He lay on the floor of his study, trembling uncontrollably, a man of logic and reason who had just been shown that the world was infinitely more terrible and strange than he had ever imagined. The doll's house sat on its table, dark, silent, and inert once more. But it was no longer a prize. It was no longer a beautiful object. It was a weapon. It was a portal. It was a window into a hell that was not content to stay on its own side. And he, Mr. Arthur Dillett, was its new and terrified keeper. Mr. Dillett lay on the floor of his study, the rich, familiar pattern of the Persian rug a strange and unwelcome sight. He wished the floor would open up and swallow him. He was a man adrift, his anchor of logic and reason having been decisively severed. The screams from the street outside had faded, leaving behind a profound and ringing silence, a silence that was now filled with the echo of their terror and the lingering, spectral image of the creature's black, unblinking eyes. He pushed himself up into a sitting position, his body aching, his mind a bruised and tender thing. He stared across the room at the doll's house. It sat on its table in the moonlight, dark, silent, and inert. It was, to all outward appearances, once again just a toy, a beautiful, inanimate object of wood, wax, and glass. But he knew better. He knew what it was. He had seen the malevolent life that pulsed within it. He had witnessed the horrifying play it performed, and he had felt the cold, chilling touch of its supernatural broadcast. The vision was over, but the horror remained, now transformed from a shocking, immediate terror into a series of deep, chilling, and unanswerable questions. The first and most profound of these was the new and terrible understanding of the doll's house itself. It was not a self-contained unit. It was not a sealed prison where a spectral tragedy was doomed to repeat itself in isolation. The connection to the screaming children had revealed a far more horrifying truth. The doll's house was a lens. It was a focal point, an amplifier for a supernatural sickness. It took the concentrated horror from within its own tiny walls and projected it outwards, into the real world. It was a psychic plague, and it used the house as its point of origin, its patient zero, to infect the minds of those nearby. He thought of the dealer who had sold it to him, the man's nervous energy and his desperation to be rid of it. Had he too heard the screams? Had he seen the property values in his neighborhood plummet as families with children moved away, driven off by inexplicable night terrors and a lingering sense of profound unease? This understanding shifted Mr. Dillett's role from that of a terrified witness to that of an unwilling and deeply responsible keeper. He could not simply sell the house, passing the curse on to another unsuspecting collector. He could not donate it to a museum, where it might sit in a darkened room, broadcasting its silent mental poison to crowds of innocent children on school trips. He couldn't even, he suspected, destroy it. What would happen if he took a hatchet to it, or set it on fire? Would he be destroying the prison, or would he be releasing the prisoners? Would smashing the lens break the projection, or would it shatter it into 1,000 pieces, each one capable of starting a new nightmare? He was trapped, bound by his own conscience to be the warden of this terrible object. And then there was the central, most grotesque question of all. The question of the creature. The murder of the old man doll had been a shocking and brutal sight, but it was, in its own way, a human-scale horror. It was a crime of passion, of violence, a ghost story of a familiar kind. But the thing in the cradle that was a horror from a different, more ancient, and far more terrible dimension. What was it? Was it, in some literal, horrifying sense, the baby of the house? The offspring of the old man and woman, born a monster? A creature so unspeakable that its existence had to be hidden away? Its true nature the source of the family's tragedy? Was the stooping shadow that committed the murder the spirit of a disgraced doctor or a terrified midwife, doomed to eternally repeat the act of silencing the one person, the old man who threatened to reveal the monstrous secret in the nursery? Or was the creature something else entirely? Was it a demon, a parasitic entity that had been summoned into the house by some dark dabbling in the occult by a previous owner? Was it a hunger that had been given form, feeding on the recurring loop of misery and violence, growing stronger with each nightly performance? In this interpretation, the dolls were not just victims. They were fuel. Their eternal, repeating agony was a sacrifice that nourished the pale, doughy abomination in the cradle. This second possibility seemed, to Mr. Dillett, even more terrifying. It implied that the horror was not a static, repeating loop, but a dynamic, growing one. The house was not just a stage for a tragedy. It was a farm, and it was harvesting sorrow. And what of the vision itself? The final, chilling question was about its purpose. Why was he shown this? The previous owner, the reclusive Mr. Everett, had apparently spent hours just looking at it. Had he also been a witness to the nightly play? Was watching the performance a part of the curse? Were they, the owners, meant to be the audience, their terror and revulsion somehow a necessary component of the ritual? Mr. Dillett felt a cold dread as he realized his role may have been preordained. He was a collector, a man whose entire life was dedicated to looking, to observing. He was the perfect audience. The house had found its new patron. He finally found the strength to stand, his legs unsteady. He walked slowly, hesitantly, back towards the table. He did not want to, but he had to look again. He had to confirm that it was over, that the dolls were back in their original static positions. He reached the table and, with a trembling hand, reached out and swung the front of the house open. The interior was dark and silent. He brought his lamp closer. The drawing room was just as he had first seen it that afternoon. The old man and woman dolls were sitting placidly in their chairs, their painted smiles serene and vacant. The old man was not sprawled on the floor. Upstairs, the nursemaid stood by the cradle. And in the cradle, nestled in the blankets, was the round, smooth, bald head of what looked like an ordinary baby doll. The pale, frog-like creature was gone. Or it was hiding again, wearing its disguise. He stared at the peaceful, domestic scene, and it was now the most terrifying sight of all. The placid smiles of the dolls, the neatness of the roomset was all a lie. It was a mask, a carefully constructed facade designed to hide the screaming, violent, and monstrous reality that lay just beneath the surface, waiting for the clock to strike one again. He closed the front of the house with a quiet, final click. He knew what he had to do. He could not destroy it. He could not sell it. He had to contain it. He would take it to the most secure room in his house, a small, windowless vault in the cellar where he kept his most valuable manuscripts. He would lock it away in the dark, wrap it in heavy black cloth, and try to forget what he had seen. But he knew he would never forget. He would be forever haunted by the lingering questions. What was the true story of the family who had first owned this house? What sin had they committed to bring such a curse upon themselves? And what, exactly, was the pale, silent creature that wore the skin of a baby and crawled through the halls of the doll's house of death. The vision was over, but the questions would remain unanswered for the rest of his tormented life. The vision is over, but the horror remains. Mr. Dillett now owns a stage for a repeating murder and a home for an unspeakable creature. The doll's house is not just an object. It is a window into hell. What does the grotesque frog-like creature truly represent? And what is the real story behind this cursed doll's house? Let us know what you think below. The final page is turned, but the chill will linger long after the screen goes dark. Subscribe and return for the next secret we unearth.